Hello, everybody. This is Joseph P. Farrell with news and views from the Nefarium for October. It's already October, Thursday, the 2nd, 2014. So much news in the last week. I don't know where to start. I've pulled 3 articles that I think are very interesting. I want to draw your attention to. All of the articles are from RT, and the reason I'm doing this, I hope, will become clear as we proceed. The first article is titled Target ISIS First Batch of Russian Fighter Jets Arrives in Iraq. And I want to read you most of this article down to a very significant statement. It states as follows, quote, "The first delivery of Russian Sukhoi fighter jets arrived in Iraq on Saturday," the country's defense ministry said. Iraqi Prime Minister al-Maliki is hoping the jets will make a difference in the fight against ISIS. The Iraqi Ministry of Defense on Sunday confirmed receiving 5 Su-25 fighter jets in accordance with a deal with Moscow. The jets were delivered by a Russian I believe that's an Antonov 124 transport plane in a dismantled state and are expected to be set up and become operational within 3 to 4 days. The Sukhoi Su-25 is an air-to-ground support and anti-terrorism mission aircraft. In these difficult times, we are in great need of such aircraft. With God's help, we will be able to deploy them to support our ground forces on a mission against the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant militias within the next 3 to 4 days. The Iraqi Army Lieutenant General Anwar Hamid Amen Ahmed told RT's Repli news agency at an airport receiving the jets. According to General Ahmed, Iraq will wage a massive attack on insurgents with the help of the jets. We have experienced, and this is the general talking, we have experienced pilots and other professionals. Our Russian friends have also sent their own experts to assist us in preparing the aircraft. All the logistics have been planned for as well, unquote, the Lieutenant General said, unquote. Now, interesting that, because if you've been following the stories in the news about ISIS and its probable connection at some point to the West and to American intelligence services, kind of staging more conflict with preferred resolution, this is an interesting move on Russia's part. Because what it's signaling, I think, is that Russia is not going to sit by again and let a unipolar situation be dictated by the West, by the United States and its NATO allies. So a very, very interesting move. And notice something, that the Russians not only sent the jets, they sent advisors. So this could quickly turn into a very interesting geopolitical game now that Russia is involved in the area. And I suspect that, again, that Mr. Putin is doing this because if there's any settlement that is going to occur as a result of any prolonged campaign against ISIS, he wants to make sure that Russia's sitting at the table, that this will not be another affair that the West is going to dictate unilaterally. A very interesting move. Now, the next article from RT is kind of in the same vein. And this one I found intensely curious. This was shared with me, incidentally, by someone who regularly reads the website up in Canada. And this article from RT is titled, quote, "Germany unable to fulfill some NATO obligations," says its Ministry of Defense. Now, there's some interesting statements here, and I want you to listen very, very carefully. And I want to put this in context by drawing your attention to something I said a few weeks ago, not only on these video blogs, but on the written blogs on the website. Germany's is the 4th largest economy in the world, or 5th, depending on which source you consult. So in other words, you got a large economy on a narrow population base. Now, with that in mind, listen to this. Quote, "Berlin would not be currently able to keep its defense promises to its NATO allies," Germany's defense minister Ursula von der Leyen told Bild am Sonntag. Quote, "With our airborne defense systems, we are currently below the target figures announced 1 year ago defining what we would want to make available to NATO within 180 days in case of an emergency, unquote, von der Leyen stated. Further down in this article, it states, at the moment, only 24 out of 109 Eurofighters are ready for service, and 38 of 89, less than half, of the Luftwaffe's Tornado fighters would be utilized properly. In a war in the Baltic, the Army would be overwhelmed. Okay? And at the very end, the article states, this comes as Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier told the UN General Assembly on Saturday that Berlin was ready to take on a greater international role. All right, now, I'll tell you what I think is happening there, and let me be very blunt. I think Germany is lying. Okay? And the interesting thing here is, I think it's a bit of, as my friend who shared that article and brought it to my attention wrote in his email, he said, a bit of passive aggression. Well, exactly. Because we know that Germany's been walking this very delicate tightrope as far as foreign policy and sanctions against Russia and all of that's concerned. And I think this is a bit of make-believe bookkeeping. Because remember something, folks. Not that many years ago, Germany sent troops to Afghanistan as part of the quote-unquote NATO. It was predominantly a U.S.-led effort there, but sent troops to Afghanistan and, incidentally, into Iraq. All right? So, in other words, it's not as if Germany is incapable of projecting military power. What's really going on here, I suspect, is that we're being told that they've let their military fall into desuetude and, oh, poor us, we're not able to help you in all of your military adventures. So, in other words, it's I think, a case of Germany bowing out. And if that's the case, this is the important point. If that's the case, then the most pivotal military member of NATO, other than the United States and perhaps France, is now saying, we are not 100% on board with NATO policies. So we may be looking at those predicted fissures within the Atlantic Alliance that I've been predicting may be happening very shortly. Now, the big news, as far as I'm concerned, in the last couple of weeks was that awful speech by President Obama in the UN General Assembly. And I wouldn't have noticed this, quite frankly, had not former Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Catherine Austin Fitts, brought my attention to it on a recent visit. She said, you got to watch this. And she didn't say why, so I turned on YouTube and I watched this speech. And I was looking primarily at the various national delegations that the camera panned during that speech. And I have to tell you that most people that were listening struck me as listening in a state. I watched their body language and their facial expressions very carefully. And it appeared to me as if most of the delegates were bored. And to a certain extent, I think some of them registered the expression of being appalled or in a state of shock and disbelief of what Obama was actually saying. All right. And I told this to Secretary Fitts. I said, I don't believe it. Nobody believes him. You know, the whole room looks like they're just, you know, being polite and listening to a speech, but they know it's a pack of lies. Well, interestingly enough, the Russian foreign minister began his own reaction shortly thereafter, Mr. Lavrov. And this again is from RT. I want you to listen very carefully to this particular article, because at the end, he gives an indication that this was precisely the reaction not only of the Russian delegation, but I think what he's hinting at is this was the reaction of many of the other delegates. I even looked at the delegates from the United Kingdom, and they looked bored, they looked appalled, they looked like they were in a state of cynical disbelief. So in other words, I think Mr. Lavrov is tapping into something here. I want to read this article from RT. It's titled Russia tops ISIS threat, Ebola worst of all. Lavrov puzzled by Obama's UN speech. Now listen to this. The Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, was puzzled with Barack Obama's ranking of international threats. Deadly Ebola virus top, followed by so-called Russian aggression, and ISIS in Syria and Iraq only third. Gathered at the UN headquarters in New York, the world leaders attending the 69th General Assembly heard Barack Obama highlighting the three most significant global threats today. Quoting Obama now, "As we gather here, an outbreak of Ebola overwhelms public health systems in West Africa and threatens to move rapidly across borders. Russian aggression in Europe recalls the days when large nations trampled small ones in pursuit of territorial ambition." Now, I have to stop right there. The hypocrisy of such a statement, given the United States' involvement in the Ukraine, in toppling a legitimate government, and in backing elements of a new government in a coup that have connections to radical, rabid, right-wing groups, dating in some cases and connected to, in some cases, back to Nazi networks from World War II and the Gehlen Organization and Stefan Bandera, absolutely boggles my mind. Talk about a large nation trampling on small ones in the pursuit of territorial ambition. And then he goes on to say, quote, "The brutality of terrorists in Syria and Iraq forces us to look into the heart of darkness," unquote, the U.S. leader said at the beginning of his statement, unquote. Now, before I continue with the rest of this article, this hypocrisy, I think, was the target. This opening statement was so out there. This was the reason you saw that reaction, if any of you saw that UN speech, on the faces of the national delegations there, all right? Now, at the end of this article, this is what Russia's foreign minister said. Listen carefully. Quote, "Reacting to the speech, Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, spoke with astonishment. Quote, 'We earned the second place among the threats to international peace and stability,' unquote, Lavrov told journalists on the sidelines of the UN Assembly. Not only the ranking of international threats seemed bizarre to Lavrov, it seems bizarre to me too, especially in the light of the current strikes in Iraq and Syria that bypassed the UN mandate, but also Obama's certainty that the world has become freer and safer. I didn't understand," this is Lavrov, "I didn't understand whether he was serious or not." And folks, that says it right there, because as I watched the speech and looked at those delegates, that's the expression that was on their faces. Is he serious? Is he for real? Is he from the real world? I didn't understand whether he was serious or not, and whether there was an Orwellian element in it. Because George Orwell invented the Ministry of Truth, and it looks like this philosophy is lingering, unquote. That's the Russian foreign minister, folks. That's how seriously sick, out of touch with reality this really is. But I want to comment on the Ebola thing there just very briefly. I think the Ebola issue will be used as a geopolitical issue to expand America's presence in Africa. And we've already seen this happening, and it's going to continue. So in other words, once again, the United States is alienating most of the rest of the world with a totally unreal geopolitical picture of the world. So that's it for my news and views today. Russian jets in Iraq, and an unprepared German military, and disbelief and Orwellian shock on the part of the Russian foreign minister. That's it. We'll see you on the flip side, everybody. God bless.